What if the most powerful financial institution in America was not a bank, not a government agency, but a single man? For nearly 4 decades, from the collapse of one century into the birth of another, there was no Federal Reserve. There was no central bank. There was no lender of last resort written into law. There was only John Pierpont Morgan. And when the American economy trembled, when banks failed by the dozens, when the United States Treasury itself ran out of gold, it was not the government that saved the system. It was Morgan. Sitting in his private library on Madison Avenue, surrounded by Renaissance paintings and medieval manuscripts, one man decided which banks would live and which would die. One man decided whether the American economy would survive or collapse. The Pujo Committee investigation of 1912 would later document that Morgan and his associates held 72 directorships in 47 of the largest corporations in America. That these men controlled resources totaling more than $22 billion at a time when the entire federal budget was barely $700 million. That is not influence. That is not power. That is a parallel government. Most history books describe Morgan as a banker who happened to be powerful. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if Morgan was not a product of the financial system, but its architect? Let me show you how one man built, controlled, and ultimately transformed the entire machinery of American finance, and why the system he created never really disappeared. The world John Pierpont Morgan entered on April 17, 1837, was a world without financial stability. The very year of his birth, America was convulsing through the Panic of 1837, a depression that would last 7 years and destroy nearly half of all banks in the country. This was not coincidence. This was context. The financial system Morgan would eventually dominate was at his birth a system of chaos. To understand what Morgan built, you must first understand what existed before him. In the mid-19th century, there was no central bank in the United States. The Second Bank of the United States had lost its charter in 1836, and President Andrew Jackson had declared war on centralized banking power. What replaced it was a patchwork of state-chartered banks, each issuing their own currency, each operating under different rules, each vulnerable to runs and panics. By 1860, there were more than 8,000 different types of paper money circulating in America. Some was legitimate. Some was counterfeit. Much was worthless. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If you were a merchant in New York receiving payment from a buyer in Ohio, you had no way of knowing if the banknotes you received would be honored. Currency guides were published weekly, listing which banknotes were trading at what discount. A $10 note from a Cincinnati bank might be worth $8 in New York, or it might be worth nothing at all if the bank had failed since the guide was printed. Into this chaos came Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, who established himself in London as a partner in the banking house of George Peabody and Company. The elder Morgan understood something crucial. In a world of uncertain currencies and unreliable banks, the real power lay not in holding money, but in controlling its movement. International trade required letters of credit, bills of exchange, and correspondent relationships that could span the Atlantic. Whoever controlled those channels controlled commerce itself. By the time young J.P. Morgan entered his father's business in 1857, at the age of 20, the family already occupied a strategic position. They were Americans who operated in London, with connections to the most powerful banking houses in Europe. They were international at a time when most American banks were hopelessly local. And they understood that the Civil War, which erupted just 4 years later, would transform everything. The Civil War did not just divide the nation. It created modern American finance. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 established a new system of nationally chartered banks and, for the first time, a uniform national currency. The federal government, desperate to finance the war, issued hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds. And the men who could distribute those bonds, who had the relationships and the reach to place them with investors in London and Paris and Frankfurt, became the most powerful financiers in the nation. Morgan's firm, which he had established in New York as Drexel, Morgan & Company in 1871, positioned itself at the center of this new world. The firm became the primary American agent for distributing government bonds to European investors. When the United States needed capital, it came to Morgan. When European investors wanted American securities, they came to Morgan. The intermediary position was not merely profitable, it was powerful beyond measure. But the official story of Morgan's rise focuses on his banking acumen, his famous integrity, his ability to inspire confidence in nervous investors. What it often misses is the structural position he occupied. Morgan did not simply work within the financial system. He sat at its choke point. Every major flow of capital between America and Europe passed through his hands or the hands of his competitors. And by the 1880s, Morgan had systematically reduced the number of competitors. The first great demonstration of Morgan's method came not in banking, but in railroads. And it revealed a pattern that would define American finance for the next century. By 1880, the American railroad industry was a catastrophe of overbuilding and cutthroat competition. Multiple lines ran parallel routes, slashing prices until none could make a profit. Bankruptcies were endemic. Investors, particularly the European investors whose capital had built the railroads, were losing fortunes. Morgan saw this chaos not as a problem to avoid, but as an opportunity to exploit. The pattern was simple. Competition created instability. Instability destroyed value. Consolidation restored order. And whoever orchestrated the consolidation controlled the result. In 1885, Morgan summoned the presidents of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad to a meeting aboard his yacht, the Corsair. The two companies had been engaged in ruinous rate wars, building competing lines, destroying each other's profits. Morgan proposed a simple solution: stop competing, divide territories, maintain prices. The meeting, which became known as the Corsair Compact, lasted a single day. By its end, the two most powerful railroads in America had agreed to coordinate rather than compete. Morgan had not bought either company. He had not invested additional capital. He had simply imposed order through the force of his position and personality. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Morgan had no legal authority over either railroad. He held no government position. He commanded no army. And yet, two of the largest corporations in America submitted to his arbitration because they understood a fundamental truth. Morgan controlled access to capital. Any railroad that defied him would find it very difficult to raise money in New York or London. Any railroad that cooperated would find Morgan's support invaluable. This was not new. The same pattern had appeared in Europe, where the Rothschild banking family had wielded similar power over governments and industries. What was new was the scale. American railroads were the largest corporations in the world. American capital markets were growing faster than any others, and Morgan was positioning himself at the center of both. Over the next 15 years, Morgan extended this pattern across the railroad industry. When lines went bankrupt, Morgan reorganized them, typically diluting existing shareholders, installing his own directors, and ensuring that the restructured company would cooperate rather than compete with its neighbors. By 1900, Morgan controlled or influenced railroads, accounting for roughly 1/6 of all American track. These were not small regional lines. These were the great trunk routes connecting the eastern seaboard to the Midwest and beyond. Morgan did not merely own stock in these companies, he controlled their boards. He selected their presidents. He determined their policies. The railroads were technically independent corporations with thousands of shareholders. In practice, they were extensions of Morgan's will. But here is what most people do not understand. The railroad consolidation was not merely about railroads. It was about establishing a method. Morgan had demonstrated that he could impose order on a chaotic industry, enrich his investors in the process, and emerge with control over the resulting structure. The question was whether the same pattern could be applied elsewhere. The answer would come in steel. At the turn of the 20th century, the American steel industry looked much like the railroads had looked in the 1880s. Dozens of companies competed viciously, building excess capacity, slashing prices, and destroying each other's profits. Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel Company dominated production, but it faced constant challenges from competitors who were willing to lose money to gain market share. Morgan saw the same opportunity he had seen in railroads. Competition was destroying value. Consolidation would restore it. But steel was different from railroads in one crucial respect. Carnegie was not merely the largest producer, he was the most efficient. His plants had the lowest costs. His methods were the most advanced. Any consolidation that did not include Carnegie would leave the most dangerous competitor outside the combination. The conventional narrative describes what happened next as a straightforward business transaction. Morgan wanted to create a steel trust. Carnegie wanted to retire. They negotiated a price. The deal closed. But the underlying dynamics were more revealing. Carnegie was 65 years old in 1900 and had been publicly musing about retirement. But he was also a fighter who reveled in competition. His company was generating profits of $40 million per year. He had no financial need to sell, and he distrusted Morgan, whom he viewed as a Wall Street manipulator rather than a true industrialist. The question was not whether Carnegie would sell, but what would make him sell. The answer was fear. Throughout 1900, Morgan began assembling a coalition of Carnegie's competitors. He merged Federal Steel Company, National Steel Company, National Tube Company, and American Steel and Wire Company into a combination that, while smaller than Carnegie Steel, was large enough to threaten a massive price war. Morgan let it be known that he was prepared to build new plants, invade Carnegie's markets, and fight a battle of attrition that could last years. Carnegie responded with his own threats. He announced plans to build a new tube plant that would destroy National Tube's business. He talked of constructing his own railroad to bypass the Pennsylvania Railroad, which Morgan influenced. For several months, the two titans maneuvered, each threatening to unleash chaos if the other did not yield. The resolution came in January 1901 through an intermediary. Charles Schwab, Carnegie's president, gave a famous speech at a dinner attended by Morgan. The speech outlined the potential of a consolidated steel industry with unified management, coordinated production, and eliminated waste. Morgan was intrigued. Within days, Schwab was meeting privately with Morgan, presenting the case for acquisition. Within weeks, Morgan had authorized Schwab to approach Carnegie with an offer. Carnegie wrote his price on a slip of paper, $480 million. Morgan accepted without negotiation. When the deal closed, Carnegie received the largest personal payout in business history to that point. But Morgan received something more valuable. He received control. United States Steel Corporation, incorporated on February 25, 1901, was capitalized at $1.4 billion. It was the first billion-dollar corporation in history, at a time when the entire federal budget was barely $500 million. The company controlled 65% of American steel production. It owned iron mines, coal mines, railroads, and steamships. It employed more than 168,000 workers. And its board of directors was stacked with Morgan partners and allies. Let that sink in. One corporation, controlled by one man's associates, dominated an industry that produced the material building every factory, every railroad, every bridge, and every skyscraper in the fastest growing economy on Earth. This was not merely market power. This was structural power over the physical expansion of industrial civilization. But the creation of U.S. Steel revealed something else. The pattern Morgan had perfected was not limited to reorganizing existing industries. It could create entirely new structures of control. Morgan had not simply combined steel companies. He had created a template for corporate consolidation that would be replicated across the American economy. The scale of what followed is staggering when you look at actual records. In the 5 years after U.S. Steel's formation, Morgan and his allies orchestrated the consolidation of International Harvester, which controlled 85% of the agricultural equipment market. They assembled International Mercantile Marine, a combination of the major Atlantic shipping lines. They created American Telephone and Telegraph as a dominant communications monopoly. They reorganized General Electric, which Morgan had helped found in 1892. Each consolidation followed the same pattern. Competing companies were combined. Competition was eliminated. Control was centralized in boards dominated by Morgan men. The result was a concentration of economic power unprecedented in American history. By 1912, when the Pujo Committee began its investigation, Morgan partners and directors sat on the boards of corporations controlling resources worth more than $22.2 billion. To put that in perspective, the total assessed value of all property in the 22 states west of the Mississippi River was $22.8 billion. Morgan's network controlled wealth equivalent to half the American continent. But the concentration of corporate control was only part of the architecture. The more profound source of Morgan's power lay in his relationship with the banking system itself. And this is where the pattern becomes truly revelatory. In a nation without a central bank, someone had to perform the functions a central bank typically provides. Someone had to maintain confidence in the financial system. Someone had to provide liquidity in times of crisis. Someone had to serve as the lender of last resort. Morgan had, effectively, appointed himself to this role, and the system had accepted it because it had no alternative. The first major demonstration came during the Panic of 1893. A stock market collapse triggered a run on banks. The Treasury's gold reserve fell below the psychological threshold of $100 million. Foreign investors, fearing that America would abandon the gold standard, began withdrawing their capital. The government itself faced the possibility of default. President Grover Cleveland was desperate. The normal remedy would have been to issue bonds and replenish the Treasury's gold supply. But Congress had refused to authorize new bond issues. The Treasury had no mechanism to act unilaterally. The government of the most powerful industrializing nation on earth was paralyzed by its own institutional design. Morgan stepped into the vacuum. In February 1895, he proposed a solution. A syndicate of private bankers, led by Morgan and the Rothschild family, would provide the Treasury with $65 million in gold in exchange for government bonds. The syndicate would guarantee that no gold would leave the country during the life of the contract, effectively using their control over international exchange to protect the Treasury from further hemorrhage. Think about what this meant. A private banker was proposing to guarantee the financial stability of the United States government, not through patriotic charity, but through a profitable transaction that would give his syndicate enormous influence over Treasury policy. Cleveland had no choice. He accepted Morgan's terms. The deal saved the Treasury. It also demonstrated something profound about the American financial system. In a crisis, the government did not save the banks. The banks saved the government. And the banks, in this context, meant increasingly Morgan. This pattern repeated even more dramatically during the Panic of 1907. The trigger was the failure of speculation in copper stocks, which led to runs on several New York trust companies. The trust companies, which operated outside the regulated banking system, had fueled a speculative boom with aggressive lending. When confidence collapsed, they had no reserves to meet their depositors' demands. The standard history describes Morgan as a hero who rallied the banking community to save the financial system. And in one sense, this is accurate. Over 2 terrifying weeks in October and November 1907, Morgan summoned the presidents of New York's major banks to his library. He assessed which institutions could be saved and which must be allowed to fail. He allocated rescue funds with the precision of a general deploying troops. He personally locked the assembled bankers in his library at one point, refusing to let them leave until they had pledged the necessary funds. But the deeper truth is more complex. Morgan was not merely responding to a crisis. He was managing it to produce specific outcomes. Institutions he favored received support. Institutions he considered unsound were allowed to collapse. Competitors who had challenged his dominance found themselves suddenly vulnerable. And when the crisis ended, Morgan's position was stronger than ever. The most revealing episode involved the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. As the panic intensified, Morgan learned that a major brokerage firm, Moore and Schley, was on the verge of collapse. The firm held massive amounts of Tennessee coal stock as collateral for loans. If the firm failed, the stock would be dumped on the market, triggering another wave of panic. Morgan's solution was elegant. U.S. Steel, which he controlled, would acquire Tennessee coal. This would prop up the stock price, save Moore and Schley, and stabilize the market. There was just one problem. Such an acquisition might violate antitrust law. U.S. Steel was already the dominant player in the industry. Adding Tennessee coal would only increase its market power. Morgan dispatched two of his partners to Washington. They arrived at the White House at dawn, before President Theodore Roosevelt had finished breakfast. They explained the situation and requested assurance that the administration would not challenge the acquisition. Roosevelt, faced with the prospect of continued financial chaos, agreed. U.S. Steel acquired Tennessee coal for $45 million in bonds. The company's actual value was later estimated at between $700 million and $1 billion. Morgan had used a financial crisis to execute one of the most profitable acquisitions in American history, with the explicit blessing of the federal government. The parallel to subsequent financial crises is striking. In 2008, a century after Morgan's maneuvers, similar patterns would emerge. Financial institutions deemed too big to fail would be rescued, while others were allowed to collapse. Acquisitions that would normally face antitrust scrutiny would be approved in the name of systemic stability, and those who managed the crisis would emerge stronger than before. But in 1907, there was a crucial difference. Morgan was 70 years old. He would not live forever, and the system that depended on his personal judgment and relationships was therefore unsustainable. The Panic of 1907 had demonstrated that the American financial system needed something it had explicitly rejected since the 1830s. It needed a central bank. The movement to create a central bank began almost immediately after the 1907 panic subsided. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr., led the effort. In November 1910, Aldrich gathered a small group of the nation's most powerful bankers at a hunting club on Jekyll Island, Georgia. The meeting was so secret that participants used first names only and refused to acknowledge it publicly for years afterward. The attendees included Henry Davison, a Morgan partner, Benjamin Strong, president of Bankers Trust and a Morgan ally, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb and Company. These men, representing perhaps 25% of the world's wealth, spent 10 days drafting the plan that would become the Federal Reserve System. Most accounts treat the Jekyll Island meeting as a conspiracy, but this misses the point. The men who gathered there were not hiding from the public because they were doing something illegitimate. They were hiding because they knew that any plan associated with the money trust would face immediate political opposition. They needed to create a structure that would perform the functions Morgan had performed privately, but would appear to be a public institution accountable to democratic oversight. The plan they drafted contained a fundamental contradiction that persists to this day. The Federal Reserve would be technically independent of both government and private banking interests, but it would be structured to ensure that bankers dominated its operations. Regional Federal Reserve banks would be owned by private member banks. The New York Federal Reserve, which would dominate the system due to New York's central role in American finance, would be controlled by the same institutions that had controlled the financial system under Morgan. When the Federal Reserve Act passed in December 1913, Morgan was not there to see it. He had died 8 months earlier in Rome at the age of 75. But the system that replaced his personal dominion was, in many ways, an institutionalization of his methods. Private bankers would continue to exercise decisive influence over monetary policy. The concentration of financial power would continue, now with government sanction rather than despite government opposition. The pattern did not end, it evolved. In the months before his death, Morgan had been forced to testify before the Pujo Committee. The hearings, officially the House Committee on Banking and Currency's investigation of the Money Trust, represented the most thorough examination of Morgan's power ever conducted. The committee's counsel, Samuel Untermeyer, questioned Morgan for hours about his control over American finance. The exchange that has echoed through history came when Untermeyer asked Morgan about the basis of credit. Was it not true, Untermeyer suggested, that Morgan could make or break any business in America simply by extending or withholding credit? Morgan's response was revealing. "No, sir. The first thing is character," Morgan said. "Before money or anything else. Money cannot buy it. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom." Untermeyer pressed. Was it not true that Morgan controlled credit through the network of interlocking directorates his partners occupied? Morgan denied it. He insisted that commercial credit was based on money and property, not on personal relationships. But the committee's final report told a different story. It documented 341 directorships held by Morgan partners in 112 corporations worth $22.2 billion. It detailed how Morgan had used his control over credit to force competitors to submit to his reorganizations. It described a system in which 5 banking houses, all connected through shared directors and partners, dominated American finance. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was unmistakable. One man and his allies had constructed a parallel financial government that operated alongside and often above the official government of the United States. The question was, what would be done about it? The answer, ultimately, was not to dismantle the concentration of power, but to institutionalize it. The Federal Reserve, created 9 months after Morgan's death, transferred the functions he had performed to a quasi-public institution. But the institution was designed by his allies, staffed by his protégés, and operated according to principles he had established. Benjamin Strong, who became the first president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914, was a Morgan man through and through. He would dominate Federal Reserve policy for the next 14 years, until his death in 1928. The Morgan Bank itself evolved but did not disappear. J.P. Morgan and Company continued as a dominant force in American finance throughout the 20th century. In 2000, it merged with Chase Manhattan Corporation to form J.P. Morgan Chase, which remains, as of today, the largest bank in the United States, with assets exceeding $4 trillion. The name persists. The institution persists. The pattern persists. So let us connect all the pieces. John Pierpont Morgan was born into a world of financial chaos, where thousands of currencies circulated, banks failed routinely, and no institution existed to impose order. He positioned himself at the choke point of international capital flows, controlling the channel through which European money entered the American economy. He used that position to orchestrate the consolidation of railroads, then steel, then banking itself. He performed the functions of a central bank through private means, deciding in moments of crisis which institutions would survive and which would fail. And when he died, the system he had created was institutionalized in the Federal Reserve, an institution designed by his associates to perpetuate his methods. The pattern that Morgan established has never disappeared. Financial crises continue to be managed by allowing certain institutions to fail while rescuing others. Concentration in the banking sector has increased, not decreased, with the largest banks today controlling a larger share of assets than Morgan's network controlled in 1912. The Federal Reserve continues to operate as a hybrid institution, technically independent, but deeply influenced by the financial institutions it regulates. And when crises emerge, the same dynamic that Morgan exploited persists. Those who manage the crisis consolidate their position. Those who created it often escape consequence. Those who bear the costs are rarely those who made the decisions. The architecture changes, the pattern remains. Morgan once said that he did not want to be in a business that was only good when times were good. He wanted businesses that were good in all times. The financial system he built has fulfilled that criterion perfectly. In booms, it generates enormous profits for those at the center. In busts, it captures public resources to survive. In all conditions, it concentrates power in the hands of those who control the flow of credit. We are not living in a world that escaped Morgan's influence. We are living in a world he built. The Federal Reserve, the too-big-to-fail banks, the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington, the assumption that financial stability requires deferring to financial expertise. These are not accidents of history. They are the direct descendants of structures Morgan created and methods he perfected. One man did not merely participate in the financial system. He constructed its architecture. And a century after his death, we still live inside the building.